Thank you, Camille. Well, so I have the pleasure of kicking off this wonderful panel on probably one of the hottest policy topics this year in the state budget process, which of course is always what gets me up in the morning, and a very aptly named panel around recent developments in transitional kindergarten. Now, as a policy wonk, I have to say I was struck by the title of the panel right away, but am always struck by how aptly named transitional kindergarten is, in that it's constantly transitioning every year with a new policy proposal. This year, no different from any of the others. Truly a program in transition. But truly, how aptly it was named originally because it was meant to transition the way we think about kindergarten and the developmental appropriateness of kindergarten. But how much each year, as we move forward with the implementation of transitional kindergarten, how it is transforming and transitioning our entire early learning system and has the potential to build that necessary strong bridge between K-12 education and our early learning system. So very excited to have our panel with us today to talk about the recent developments in transitional kindergarten, including the governor's early learning block grant proposal and how that might specifically have impacts on where transitional kindergarten is going. I want to thank the Department of Finance for joining us for that. And so with that, I will introduce our first panelist, Karen Manship, who's a senior researcher from AIR, the American Institute for Research, and has just concluded the first round of a two-parter, stay tuned, of research on transitional kindergarten that we are very excited to have her give you the preliminary results on. So Karen, if you want to join us.
Thank you, Erin, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk to this group of people about the findings from our evaluation of transitional kindergarten. This is a study that we at AIR have been engaged in for several years with the support of First 5 California, the Heising Simons Foundation, and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. So the results I'm going to show you today were released in a report in December, and that is available on AIR's website and on our study website, which I will show you at the end if you would like some more details. So as you probably know, transitional kindergarten came into being as a result of the Kindergarten Readiness Act of 2010. So that law moved the cutoff date by which children had to turn 5 in order to enter kindergarten back from December 2nd to September 1st. So that policy change aligned California's kindergarten entry policies with most other states in the country. But what was unique about California is that this law also created the transitional kindergarten program as a new grade for students who were born between September 2nd and December 2nd. So these are students who, under previous law, were eligible to enter kindergarten, but as was mentioned earlier, these were very young 4-year-olds or young 5-year-olds when they entered kindergarten. And so transitional kindergarten was created as the first year of a 2-year kindergarten program for these fall birthdays. They would enter TK and then kindergarten the following year and then first grade and so on. TK, as Erin mentioned, has already evolved over its short lifespan, and I think that Deb and others will talk about those changes, but I'll just briefly mention that in the budget bill last year, there was some trailer language included that clarified that districts are allowed to enroll younger children in their transitional kindergarten programs, now called expanded TK. These are children with birthdays after December 2nd through the end of the school year. They will receive partial ADA funds or state funding for these children as soon as they turn 5. And so some districts have elected to take advantage of this clarification and enroll some younger children in their programs. But the evaluation results I'm going to share with you today, which you already got a sneak preview of from Assemblyman McCarty earlier, will focus on the impact of the TK program as it was originally designed, so as a program for these young 5-year-olds with fall birthdays. So our study design takes advantage of the fact that there's this December 2nd strict cutoff date. So if you are a child that was born before December 2nd, then you are eligible to go to TK based on your age. If you are a child born December 3rd, you are not eligible to go to TK. Instead, you would wait another year and enter kindergarten the following fall. So if you can imagine 2 children, one born on December 1st, one born on December 3rd, you can imagine that those kids are very similar. They're very close in age. There's no reason to think that their demographic characteristics are different or their experiences have been different. But the difference is that one is eligible for this TK program and the other is not. So what our study does is compares kindergarten performance, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, for the children who were age eligible for TK, and then those children who were very close in age to those children entered kindergarten at the same time, but missed the cutoff for eligibility. We had over 2,800 students in the state participating in our study. They were in 20 districts who were randomly selected to participate in the study, and over 164 schools. And these represent all geographic areas of the state. We also took a look at the students whose parents elected for them to participate in the study from the TK group and from our comparison group on the other side of the cutoff. And we compared their characteristics to make sure there was nothing else going on that would drive differences. And we found that there were no significant differences in those groups in terms of key demographic characteristics, in terms of family income, free reduced price lunch eligibility, parent education, English learner status, ethnic background, special education status. There were some interesting things to note about the groups in terms of their preschool experience, however, non-TK preschool experience specifically. So first, I'll draw your attention to this first row in this table. You can see that our comparison group, so the kids who did not attend TK because they just missed the cutoff, of those children, 81% of them attended some sort of center-based program that their parents considered preschool. So this is based on parent report. So the majority of our comparison group did have some sort of preschool program before they entered kindergarten. We don't know anything about the funding sources or the location or the quality of those programs. We do know a little bit, however, about the quantity. We did ask parents how many hours their child attended that center-based program, and we see that about 65% of those kids attended at least 15 hours a week, which is the equivalent of a part-day TK program. On the other hand, if you look at the third row, we see that the kids who went to TK were more likely to have attended preschool before attending TK. So about 3/4 of that group attended some sort of center-based program that their parents considered preschool the year before TK, in other words, 2 years before kindergarten. And in that same 3-year-old year, you can see that only about half of the comparison group attended preschool. So those asterisks there indicate that this is a statistically significant difference, which means that we worried a little bit. We wanted to make sure that this did not drive any of our differences. So we did control for this difference in our analysis, along with controls for all other demographic characteristics and also for age. So we know that these kids are very close in age, but just in case those small differences in age make a difference in their performance, we controlled for that as well. So what did we learn about how TK is working so far? In the graphs that I'm going to show you, the blue bars represent the average performance of the group that went to TK. And this is as measured in the beginning of their kindergarten year. The red bars represent the average performance of the comparison group, the kids who entered kindergarten at the same time. They're very similar in age, but they did not attend TK. So the first thing that we found is that TK had an impact on children's pre-literacy skills, specifically letter and word identification and phonological awareness. And that letter and word identification difference, you might wonder, is that a lot? What, should I care about this? That actually amounts to 5 months of learning at the beginning of kindergarten. We did not find any differences between groups on vocabulary. This is something that is not unusual. There are several other studies of early childhood programs that have not found an impact in this area. And I will also say that this is English vocabulary. We did assess children in English and Spanish, and for about 40% of our population, they are Spanish-speaking dual language learners. So we have assessments on 2 of our outcomes in English and Spanish. So we're excited to, as a next step, sort of dig into that bilingual data, but this is in English. We also found that TK students performed better in math. We have 2 different direct assessments that we administered at the beginning of kindergarten. and TK students outperformed their peers on both of those, and this amounts to about a 3-month advantage in learning. We've heard a lot about executive function in the past 24 hours. We heard Dr. Kuhl talk about it yesterday, several mentions of it today. We measure executive function differently in 5-year-olds than, for example, with the babies that we learned about last night. We use this measure called head, toes, knees, and shoulders. And I think I don't need to reiterate the importance of executive function. We've heard a lot about that. So we did find that TK students had an advantage in terms of executive function at kindergarten entry as well. The final thing that we collected data on was teachers' ratings of students' social skills and problem behaviors in the classroom. And we did not find any differences between the TK students and the non-TK group on these teacher ratings of social skills and behaviors. Okay, so what can we conclude from these charts? We conclude that TK broadly benefited students in terms of their kindergarten readiness, specifically in terms of pre-literacy skills, math skills, and executive function, but not necessarily in terms of social skills, at least how we measured it. And these effects are over and above the experiences that these students would have had they not gone to TK. In other words, the experiences that our comparison group had. So remember that 81% of that comparison group attended something that their parents considered preschool. I can't emphasize enough, however, that we cannot conclude that TK is definitively better than preschool. That is not what this says. There's a lot that we don't know about those particular preschool programs that the children attended in terms of quantity and quality. So I'll stop there. The study is still underway, so we have a lot more that we're hoping to learn, and I can tell you more about that later in the panel, but I'll stop now so that we can discuss the implications of this. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Karen. So with that, we'll go ahead and kick off a conversation with our panelists, which will be an open conversation for the group. And the opportunity for you to give us your general reactions to this very recent research that's come out. In fact, probably just as the governor's proposals ink was getting dry. So just to get some general reactions to the research and how you think it should inform the policy debate this year as we're talking about the future of the early learning system. And Dean, I don't know if you want to kick us off.
Sure. I think the study was good. It gave us a lot of foundational data about our TK programs in LAUSD. I would say that, we rolled out TK in 560 schools when we did this, so it was a large rollout. So getting the feedback on what we're doing is very helpful. I think the data also showed us that there were some implications for areas that we needed to improve on. In particular, there were some findings in social emotional, and there were some findings in physical development that if we're really looking at building a complete program, those are things that we need to look at, and they were definitely implications for the kind of PD we were going to provide. So, thank you.
Great, Deb.
Well, I think that the findings are really clear and encouraging, which is not always something you find in education research. I think it really says that the program is working as designed, which I give a lot of credit to the legislature for. And I find very significant the 5-month advantage that children have entering kindergarten. And it's the same cohort of kids who a few years ago might have started school kindergarten behind, and now they have this opportunity.
Jeff, any thoughts about how you think this research might inform the conversation this year?
I don't have too many comments on this study. In fact, I'm really not too surprised by it. I mean, there's been a lot of effort put into TK over the last couple of years, and I would have been surprised, actually, if there hadn't been any significant level of effort shown. And, for 2 years, we put all this energy and effort into it, and there's no difference. That would have been somewhat stunning. So this is kind of a somewhat self-evident to me. I mean, perhaps the bars should be a little different, but they're not. There's only a few percentage points in each instance. I'm kind of looking to see in the next couple of years, are those bars going to become larger? Don't know. We've got to see to what level, if TK stays in its current form, or if it changes. will those bars continue to grow in terms of the differences between the two programs?
Erin,
So-
can I?
oh, sure, go ahead.
I was going to say, I was going to add one thing. One thing that we did notice is, we have a large English learner population. So at the beginning of the year, the kids take the CELT. What we did find was that the 33% of the students who took the CELT in kindergarten scored advanced or early advanced, as opposed to 16% of the kids who had not had a TK experience. So I know the data that was shared was relatively close, but we noticed significant gaps and improvements with the kids who got that extra year. We also noticed that that data carried to first grade CELT, where now 80% of the kids were scoring early advanced or advanced on the CELT in first grade, which has implications for reducing the amount of long-term English learners, over-identification of kids who are learning a second language. So there were some very positive data for us as well.
And thank you, Dean, for that. I know in the panel questions, which by the way, I have pages of questions and more that I know I won't hit, but I do want to follow up with you with some specific questions about the incredible work happening in LA. But I wanted to first sort of segue from Jeff's comment, Deb, because in the local control world that we live in terms of public education, not to mention the advent of how transitional kindergarten started, it really is 1,000 flowers that are blooming. I think that that's something that we're actually very interested to see in the next round of the AIR research when they start to look down at some of the specific practices and compare them. But I'd love to hear, Deb, from Early Edge's perspective, what do you think has been successful about the TK model, and now if you'd like to elaborate specifically the ETK model, since that can be very different. And how do you think that the Early Learning Block Grant could impact that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there have been some successes and challenges. We know that TK is not perfect, but one of the challenges I think has been the transitional kindergarten combination classes. And we've seen districts, as they've expanded TK, have the ability to eliminate the combination classes and instead have standalone classes, which I think is a real opportunity. I think there's another opportunity for districts and communities to really work together to put together the pieces to look at the whole picture of early learning. So for example, if you have many 4-year-olds in state preschool and Head Start, it may not make sense to shift them over to transitional kindergarten unless you have 3-year-olds. But if you have a waiting list for state preschool or Head Start, expanding TK can be an option. So I think another thing is, as with all early childhood programs, we'd like to see greater investments in quality and in workforce. And this speaks a little bit to the block grant. I think that the successes have been the existence of TK and expanded TK, and that it's a stable revenue source, which you don't see in early childhood programs. And I think also, just to end, I really think that the AIR findings speak for themselves in terms of the linguistic and the mathematical and the cognitive benefits for kids.
Thank you. Well, so Dean, following up on Deb's point on that, so what, if you could just let everyone know in the room who's not familiar with the incredible expansion that's happening in Los Angeles Unified right now, if you could speak a little bit to the vision you have for ETK and the key elements for an ETK classroom for Los Angeles Unified, and how you might distinguish it from TK, if at all.
So I think the big thing that when we did the expanded TK was, is that we needed to do it right. We needed to make sure that we were, one, and not to sound cliche, but that we were developmentally appropriate. Two, that everybody who was working in an ETK program or expanded TK program knew what the California Preschool Learning Foundations were. Because, a lot of these programs were on elementary campuses. So one of the big things was that, and as an elementary principal, I can tell you the best lens that a lot of times that I had was kindergarten. So when I went into a classroom, I was looking for kindergarten or mini kindergarten, and we really needed to change that perspective for our district administrators and our teachers to be able to come back and say, this is what a high quality early education program looks like. And it meant simple things like doing PD with the principals over the summer, bringing them in for 2 days, and we got 115 out of 117 principals to attend, along with a lot of district administrators. And for them, it was, I'm going to say it was almost liberating in the sense that they could go into a classroom and see that if kids were playing, that could be a good thing, So, we needed to do that right. So, and one last thing, I would say the distinguishing characteristic for us is that if we're doing ETK well, it should influence how we're doing TK. Both of those groups of kids are moving to kindergarten. And so those rooms, in a lot of ways, should look very similar. And that's what we're really encouraging and pushing. So I think we're headed in the right track.
Terrific, terrific. Well, so question for you, Jeff. I think you just heard advocates for TK admit it's not necessarily perfect, right? So I think a great question that's on everyone's mind is there a specific problem, though, within transitional kindergarten that the administration is hoping to address through the Early Learning Block Grant? And you may want to answer this question first, is TK and the TK entitlement central to the governor's goal here with the Early Learning Block Grant and how it's constructed?
That's an excellent segue. I'm taking it. So here's the thing. What we see in the administration is we see kind of a patchwork of early education out there prior to traditional kindergarten, right? Before kindergarten, just straight up kindergarten, there's a variety of programs out there. So what we thought would be an idea is for the education community out there at the local level, we'll take that patchwork of funding that's under the Proposition 98 guarantee, and we'll bundle it into one block grant for them to use for early education. And that early education for us is that early education defined by that which is before traditional kindergarten. That can look like preschool, it can look like TK, it can look like ETK. That flexibility that you have is going to be something developed at the local level. But you're going to choose that at the local level, that early education, because it's the 1,000 flowers that you're talking about. It doesn't look the same all over the state, does it? Kids are different all around the state. But we want it to be out there for you with expanded flexibility. In terms of the funding, it's going to be held harmless. Folks aren't going to get their TK funding taken away. They're going to have the same amount. But we are admittedly planning to move away from an ADA funding model. That's not the model we'd like to use going forward. It would look, for all intents and purposes, kind of or feel more like something from the old categorical world. But it's not necessarily. It's a block grant per se. And we're in the process of having conversations about that right now. Now, when you saw us release it in the governor's budget, there weren't a lot of details there, were there? No, because we want to talk about it with you right now and work those out. We're working through that with our stakeholder groups and trying to develop a block grant that makes sense. Now, most of my time has been spent in the K-12 world. I don't know most of you. I haven't been in the early ed world a lot. But I have to tell you, you'd be surprised by the amount of vitriol that our office has received since introducing our proposal. Kind of surprising. The thing to remember, though, is relationships are important, and they matter. And memories at finance are long. So let's have a civil conversation and talk about what makes sense going forward. That's my pitch.
And I do think, Jeff, I think that something all of us can appreciate, regardless of how we feel about any particular component of the Early Learning Block Grant, is the enormity of being able to have this invitation from the governor, who has not been as interested as some of us in this room in having a conversation about early learning investment historically, to see that incredible shift. And to the point that you just made so eloquently, to have a conversation about more money in the system, hopefully, as well as about the plumbing. So I think we're all excited to have that conversation. So to this issue of the Early Learning Block Grant and the flexibility issue, I think that one of the pieces that a strain of questions in here that I don't know if any of you specifically want to speak to, but it's the challenges of the current TK construct and the current ETK construct. And if there are any challenges, I know, Deb, you started to touch on this a little bit, and the lack of infrastructure for quality improvement that would be necessary to really help move the dial for those TK educators who presumably are being asked to shift away from what was traditional kindergarten now to something that is different and developmentally appropriate to 4-year-olds. So are there other challenges you guys would like to highlight while you have the attention of everybody in the room?
I'd say, one of the challenges that we faced in the very beginning was, I think on my first day in the position, I got a letter from all the advocates saying, you need to be 8-to-1, you need to be 8-to-1. And I remember thinking, I don't have the money to be 8-to-1, I don't have the money to be 8-to-1. But visiting the different programs was to really start advocating for that. And so, I'm very thankful that our board and our district really looked at that and saw the importance of it. And we were able to ask for an additional funding so we could go 8-to-1 in this upcoming year for our ETK students. That's, I think one of the other challenges that we're addressing is that we have a lot of kids who have special needs. And one of the things that we really wanted to provide for them was to increase the number of spaces that we had for special needs students in our ETK programs and make them collaborative so these kids would be included in a general education setting. So we were also able to add 60 programs this year along with our 60 programs that are in our early education centers, bringing the total to 120 preschool collaborative classrooms that we'll have for this upcoming year, with either ratios of 6-to-1 or 8-to-1 in all of these programs. So that's been a huge thing, but I think, going back to the funding, if we cap it, it is tough to continue that kind of model. So.
And Karen, I know that just to this discussion about the diversity that we see when we talk about transitional kindergarten, and now with the advent of ETK, even more diverse models in place. I know that you guys are starting to look deeper into some of the different models. So what question do you want to be able to answer next when it comes to what is and is not working with transitional kindergarten as you have designed in the current study?
There are many questions I would like to answer, some of which we'll be able to answer. So I think there are a couple of slides that go along with this, so I'll tell you some of our next steps. So the first thing that we're really interested in doing is finding out if these effects that we found in the fall of kindergarten persist through the end of kindergarten. So of course this is an issue in early education research in general, so we want to see if any of these effects persist at the end of the year and potentially beyond that. And after that, we also want to look to different subgroups of students. So we want to know if TK is particularly effective for one group or another over other groups. So we'll be looking specifically at some of our larger subgroups of students. We'll be looking at girls versus boys. We'll be looking at students eligible for free or reduced price lunch, and also English learners. I think that's the order on the slide. So we are going to be looking with our additional data at the specific impact of TK on those groups. And then we're also interested in what characteristics of TK are most effective. So this is probably the part of the study that I'm the most excited about, because it's not just speaking to, does TK work? Is it just TK that we should be looking at? But it's telling us more, we're digging deeper about what characteristics are really important. What is it about TK that's bringing about these impacts that we're finding? If I had to speculate right now, I would guess it had to do with the connection to kindergarten, the alignment with kindergarten, maybe well-paid teachers, some other characteristics of TK that we're seeing. But we're interested in other questions. Deb mentioned the challenge of combination classes. So one of the things we're going to be looking at is there a differential impact of TK on students' performance based on whether they were in a standalone TK class versus a combination classroom? We're also going to be looking at different part day versus full day classrooms, and then different instructional practices within the classroom. So I'm really excited about that, answering that question. What's going on that's developmentally appropriate in the classroom? Does it matter how much focus you spend, how much time you spend teaching math versus social emotional skills, if we can teach them, per our last conversation? Versus literacy, small groups versus large groups, and other developmentally appropriate practices within the classroom. So we have a lot of information from the TK teachers that participated in the study. Big thanks to all of them for their participation. And so we're going to be able to look at what we observed and what we learned from teachers and connect that to these outcomes in kindergarten. So I think there's a lot more to learn coming. So I think Deb referred to, this is like part one, and there's going to be part two. There's probably going to be like part 3, 4, 5. more coming in the future. So.
Well, and so I think it's a question for the rest of our panel. If there was one question that you could see addressed by the next round of the research, what would you want that to be from your perspective as you're thinking about moving TK and ETK policy forward from your position?
Well, that's a good question. I think one of the big things that we would, going back to some of the data is we want to look at attendance data, discipline referral. We would also want to know long-term studies. So I know the study is only for another year, but it would really be interesting to see and follow these students. Are more of them being identified as gifted? Are less of them being referred for special education services? So there's a lot of long-term data that would be really beneficial for us to have, especially knowing if this early start really does help them.
I think that on the long-term data point, it would be great to see a study through 3rd grade. How are kids doing? Do the benefits persist? Because we know that 3rd grade is that critical point.
Jeff?
Okay, time for the heretic.
He's wearing a Tabasco tie, by the way, so he promised to be spicy.
All right. So I would be curious to see a comparison for the kids who are in 3 months now, right? And students who are in traditional kindergarten. Because I'm born in November, and TK would have held me back. And I don't really feel like I'm that maladjusted. But in this world, I would have had to stay back a year and go to TK instead of just going to traditional kindergarten. But the whole philosophy of TK says that somebody like me was not ready for traditional kindergarten, that I'm too young and I shouldn't be there. I should be in TK. And then next year, I should go to kindergarten. But that's not what happened. I went to kindergarten, went to college, got a master's degree, got a commission in the Navy, and I do the job I'm doing right now.
And everything you needed to learn, you learned in kindergarten.
I learned it in kindergarten. So I'd be very curious to see what's the difference. Because for me, I don't really feel that maladjusted in life.
Deb?
And we definitely don't think you are, Jeff. Well, I think that I view TK as an opportunity. And also, I will say that there is, if your parents had made that choice, you could have gone to kindergarten. But I think TK is an opportunity to get children ready for school. And I think that it's a choice for families.
No, I don't disagree. I'm just saying the research. I would be very curious, what are the differences in performance?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that a conversation, a lot of folks, those on the stage included, and many in the audience would love to see the longitudinal data component and the ability to better study our investments to be part of the conversation we're having this year. I think it's a wonderful opportunity, absolutely. Well, so to that issue, for each of you, and I'd love to start with Jeff, so how would you recommend that we move forward systemically? So this panel is really about TK. However, as we talked about previously, our early learning system is made of many different pipes, many different components. And the early learning block grant, of course, from the governor is one proposal on how to try to address how those pipes come together, right? So how would you best, just from your perspective, recommend integrating TK into a successful early learning system?
I think that those choices should move forward in our proposal. I think that out in what we call district land, out in the field, those pieces can be put together by districts in whatever circumstances meet their needs. And those are going to vary depending upon the populations of their student body, depending upon the plan that's going to go all the way up through high school. What are the needs of that community? How does the TK model and the ETK model and the early ed, the preschool model, what are the needs of that community? I mean, the state is varied through the central part of the state, the coastal communities, the variety of languages students speak, the variety of needs of that community when kids graduate from high school. All of this varies widely, and it's very difficult for us sitting in Sacramento to develop a one-size-fits-all model for them to impose upon them. I think they should have the choices to build the models that make sense for them. And I think that the TK model can be a part of that as a choice in whatever circumstances make sense for those districts.
But wouldn't you argue, having, for those of you who don't know in the audience, an incredible amount of experience working with K-12 school districts, argue that they have that flexibility now?
Yeah, to the large extent, but we think taking this model to the next phase and prioritizing our funds, our limited funds at the state level for low-income and at-risk students are the students that should be served first. We think they have the greatest need, and they should get the state dollar first. And then, to the extent we can, build in, like in a lot of other early ed programs, an ability to charge some level of fees for those who have an ability to pay. Because those families, those low-income families, and the families that are at risk, they don't. And they need the services the most. And that's why we think that model makes the most sense.
And I let you skirt an earlier question that I want to bring you back to then before we move on to Deb's response, and that is this issue of the TK entitlement and whether or not changing the TK entitlement, as you were just speaking to now because of the means test idea, is that central to the governor's proposal?
Yeah, see, I don't know that we see it the same way as you do in terms of an entitlement. I know a lot of people use that word. I don't think you hear us using it that word. You're using that word or calling it that.
So if you want me to rephrase the question, do you see the eligibility for any child born in that 3-month window, that the way TK is statutorily designed now, due by it being the change in the kindergarten entry date and defined as part of the free and public education system, do you see redefining that as a central component of the entire proposal?
Yes. Yeah, we see it as an early ed because kindergarten is not compulsory. So, of course, everybody wants to send their kid to kindergarten. I certainly would, but you're not required to go there. First grade is. Kindergarten, everybody should go to. Kindergarten, and particularly as we're talking about TK is early ed. And early ed is part of the proposal that we would create as a block grant. And you can design a program that looks like TK as part of an early ed program, but it can serve all kids prior to kindergarten. It doesn't have to just serve that window. I mean, there's flexibility being offered here, extraordinary flexibility we think would be offered in our block grant proposal.
So Deb, how would you then also want to think in this invitation that's been presented by the governor's office to have a systemic conversation about the early learning system? How would you want to best recommend we think about how to integrate TK into our early learning system?
Well, I would say that whether we call it an entitlement or not, I do think that transitional kindergarten and the average daily attendance funding it receives is very important, a sustainable, adequate source of funding. And also, kind of in response to how TK came about, it was because of the kindergarten entry date, and I do think there was a need for it because California was one of the few states who had a late kindergarten entry date, such young children in kindergarten. And they often didn't have the social skills and the maturity that's needed in today's kindergarten. It doesn't look like the kindergarten that I went to. I think the other thing to remember, and the reason why I think that it's so important to maintain TK, is that relating to the creation of it, that quarter of kids got something. So if they got kindergarten. So I think it's really important to recognize that. I think it's also important to recognize that there are tens of thousands of children who still don't have access to high quality early education. So as part of systemic thinking, it's really important to think about adequate funding, a stable source of funding, an aligned and comprehensive system, birth to 5. Obviously, like I was saying, quality. We have the quality infrastructure here with the quality rating and improvement system. That's very important. And lastly, I would just say I do appreciate, and your point is well taken about engaging in dialogue and a civil discourse, but I do appreciate your openness to feedback.
Absolutely. So Dean, coming from the local level, and we talk a lot at the state level about systems and funding levels, so you are engaged in an incredible systemic building process at the local level in Los Angeles Unified. So how would you want to see this conversation proceed in Sacramento, but also for you in Los Angeles?
Okay, well, I'm just going to jump out there and say that I think the early education block grant really hampers what we're trying to do in our district. I think there's a number of programs. Right now, we're in a unique place because we can offer district programs for preschool, but we also offer the subsidized care programs, which are CSPP funded. So about 85% of our 10,000 students in our early ed centers receive CSPP funding. If we had to rely solely on CCTR funding, a lot of those programs would cease to exist. The other thing I think is really important to know is that if we're really going to talk about improving the program for early education, it's not by capping it, it's by increasing the reimbursable amounts we get, it's by really putting an investment into this program. As far as working within guidelines to help with the funding, I think one of the things that we do need to look at is a lot of the families feel that when we ask for documentation in our subsidized care programs, it's kind of intrusive. We're asking a lot. We're asking for rental receipts. We're asking for, all kinds of things, parent status, and those things hamper our families and make them afraid to start coming to school. They know when they get to kindergarten, these things are not required, so they're much more likely to enroll in kindergarten. The other part I think we need to see is that we're seeing a huge increase. Every one of our early education programs since November has increased the number of students. So having that flexibility to continue to increase those programs and give parents options of whether it's a 180-day calendar, whether it's a year-round calendar, whether it's 6 to 6 operation hours, whether it's options for wraparound services. I think, if the block grant has those kinds of options built into it, then we're more likely to say, this is something we can work with. When it doesn't have those options, it is difficult for our families. Yeah.
If I could just... Am I on? Thanks. If I could just respond, this is good feedback for us to hear. This is the dialogue time that we're trying to have with the field, and getting a sense of the pieces that people want in something that is a block grant is very important to us in the administration. As I talked about at the beginning of our conversation, we're wanting to develop this proposal as part of a dialogue. This isn't something that we came out fully baked. We want to hear feedback from you all. By way of comparison, and this is probably the part of the conversation we'll have that'll make me even more popular, I thought I'd share some statistics with you all about how California compares with other states in the area of early education funding. When we talk about income eligibility and the annual dollar amounts that allow folks to qualify, California is in the top 10 when it comes to state income eligibility. As a percentage of federal poverty levels, also top 10. As a percent of state median income, top 10. For fees, while it might not seem like it, California is competitive in comparison to other state fees. We're one of only 3 states in the whole country with 0 fees at 100% of the federal poverty level. 3, our state, one of 3. Now, we're basically in the top third when it comes to reimbursement rates. Top third. Now, if you compare that, and this may not seem like it's right, but it is, we're basically in the top third in those categories. But when it comes to K-12 funding, we're in the bottom third. So we're increasing funding over the past couple years and rebuilding funding for K-12 institutions after the recession because K-12 schools got devastated, and we've been able to rebuild that, but they're still in the bottom third. But in this field, when I look at the data, and it came from the National Women's Law Center study from 2015, this area is in the top third. That doesn't mean that it's overfunded, or by any means that there isn't a lot of room to grow, or room for improvement, because there is, and I know that. But just by ways of perspective, our state's in the top third. And in K-12, we're in the bottom third. Just some perspective.
And I think it is good perspective for us all to have, Jeff, because I think coming on the heels of the Great Recession and the incredible decimation that we saw to the early learning infrastructure in California and the incredible decimation that we saw to our K-12 schools, it's very hard sometimes when you have such an eroded foundation to remember what progress we have made. But it does help shine a spotlight on what we want to make sure we don't lose, and the importance of the progress we have been able to make as we sort of march through time. So I think that on behalf of everyone in the room, I know that, in particular those on stage, that folks are excited to have an invitation to think systemically, to think about a per child amount of money that it takes to conduct a high quality program and to compensate the professionals we need in order to yield child outcomes for those children. To have the access debate, I think, is something everyone's very excited to have. What do we want to see in California in terms of access, not just in 4, but 0 through 5 and 0 through 12, as we're thinking systemically about child care, early learning, and the wrap care, because for everybody in the room who's a parent, they know that the public schools calendar does not meet child care needs, right? And then, of course, quality, consistency, and the parent engagement debate that I think everyone is very excited to have, because at the end of the day, we are talking about, in terms of the priorities the state has had, working families, and the need to be able to meet the needs of those working families that aren't able to be done necessarily traditional hours. I think that's something people are excited to do. So as I know we're starting to run short on time, I wanted to make sure I gave an appropriate amount of time to everybody on the panel to, however you would like to leave this room, in light of the research, in light of the policy conversation, yet again, on transitioning transitional kindergarten. As we're having this conversation, what would you like the panel and our audience to leave with today? Karen?
Well, actually, that last comment and Jeff's last comment made me think of something that David Kerp said earlier today about the importance of early education, or education not stopping at preschool. We're not stopping at preschool and then restarting at kindergarten for K-12, and the importance of that link. And so I think that is something that we should keep in mind in developing policy. But also I think the research suggests there's something going on here with TK that is working. And again, I think it might be the familiarity of the teachers with the K-12 system. 90-some% of them were kindergarten teachers. There's that alignment that seems to be building as a result of TK. And I think that there's more to learn there. And so overall, I think I would want the room to leave with the knowledge that there's more information coming, and there's a lot more that we're going to learn from the work that we're doing and that others are doing about specific things happening with the TK program and in the classrooms, and how that impacts children over the short and hopefully long term. So our hope is that those findings that are coming out about what instructional practices are important, what structures seem to be working, our hope is that districts will be able to take that information and make use of it in terms of improving their programs, be that TK or other early learning programs.
And then it's very important to Dean's presentation, because he spent a lot of time talking about ETK and all of the strides that are being made there. Now, your research and the follow-up is going to still be, though, specifically focused on those 3 months of the traditional TKers, correct?
Exactly.
So a big question, I think, on everyone's mind as we think about moving forward with TK policy is what is developmentally appropriate for ETK, and what is and is not working for ETK, and how do we inform best practices there. So Dean, anything you want to leave the group with?
I think the big thing is that a program, when you're talking about a system-wide program and developing something, is you really need to have all of your stakeholders with you on it, and understanding why investments in early education are crucial. When you're talking about changing life trajectories or even improving the financial infrastructure of a state, you really need to make that early investment in our kids, in our workforce, and in our families. So I would just encourage, as we look through that lens, that we remember that these really early investments are critical for the long-term success of our kids in our state.
Thank you, Deb.
I wanted to reflect a little bit about the K-12 and the early childhood education funding. I think that it's very important to think about increasing both and not one or the other, because we know the research shows that brain development happens in those earlier years, but it also must be sustained. So it's the foundation, and then it goes up into K-12, and so we need to sustain those gains. In terms of income eligibility and state median income, I wanted to say really quickly, I think California is a very high cost of living state, so that doesn't surprise me. And I also wanted to say that In terms of early childhood education funding, we're probably very low, and we don't have what it takes to provide a quality program. So for example, experienced teachers with the compensation that they need, and our per child funding for preschool is lower than other programs that we've seen in other states that do have proven outcomes for kids. But things that I would want people to leave with, the research is very clear about the gains that children can make in high quality early education. I think TK and expanded TK are bright spots in California. I hope that more children and families have those opportunities. And I think we need more kindergarten readiness opportunities, not fewer.
Thank you. Jeff?
4 things. First, Department of Finance and the administration cares about early education and education just as much as everybody else here in the room does. Our role is to make sure that the state has dependable finances for now and into the future. But we all have families, we all have kids, and we all care about them and you just as much as everybody else. But we have a role. When we think about the budget, we have to think about the budget for the entire state. We have this much for education, we have this much for early ed, we have this much for health and human services, mental health services. In addition to what we're talking about today, for example, there's a $6 billion hole in the state's transportation budget. We have a $1 billion hole for the MCO tax, for Medi-Cal. We had to put $323 million aside for drought and for fires. You guys remember the fires that happened this past fall? And we have a $72 billion unfunded retiree health plan. There's a lot of things that the state has to fund. In addition to this, it's our job to keep that in mind. We want to make sure you're aware of that while we're having these conversations. This is important. It's very important work that you do, but there's a lot of other things we have to fund as well. Keep that in mind. Third, we want to have a continuing dialogue with you. This is a very important issue. We've decided to have this conversation as an ongoing dialogue as we go into the May revision, and we want to come up with a package that everyone can wrap their arms around and go into the July budget with, that makes sense, that everybody's on board with, and that helps kids as they go from early ed all the way to K-12. Fourth, thank you very much. It's been an honor to see you all today.
Thank you. And thank you very much to the panel. I know this will prove to be, as is always in the early learning world, a very lively budget conversation. And I do know that it's great to have one informed with very relevant recent research, with incredible best practices at the local level and emerging practice. I want to thank you for all your work, Dean. And of course, with the incredible advocacy and statewide perspective that we've gotten from Early Edge and looking at what's happening that's very different in district by district, TK, ETK, and what I believe everyone in this room would like to see and is a shared goal, which is how are we thinking systemically about how TK, however it might look in an individual community, how it fits into the early learning system, how it fits into the K-12 system, and how are we building capacity for each of the pieces of that system so that they can interact together in a way that is most appropriate, high quality for children, and accessible and relevant to parents. So I just want to thank everybody on the panel for their time today, for their role in this conversation. And on behalf of the panel, also want to emphasize the importance of your role in the conversation and wish you luck in the days moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Give them a round of applause. Great conversation.